Why was one structure still warm when every cabin in the valley had gone dark and cold? It was a kind of question that lingered in the air long after the storm had passed, the kind that made experienced men pause mid-sentence, set down their coffee, and stare into the distance. By the third morning of that blizzard, temperatures outside had plunged to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 40 degrees Celsius. Firewood had run out in at least 4 homesteads along the creek road. 2 families had abandoned their cabins entirely, packing into the Halverson store on the edge of town just to survive the night. Livestock were dying in open barns. Ice formed inside windows. The frontier, which had always demanded everything from the people who chose to live on it, was now collecting its debts. But on the far eastern edge of the settlement, past the frozen bend in Cutbank Creek, a low-weathered barn sat on a ridge without a single light visible from the road. No smoke rising from a chimney. No lantern glow in the cracks of its boards. From the outside, it looked abandoned, just another dark shape in a white landscape. And yet, inside that barn, a man named Callum Reedford was sleeping comfortably under a single wool blanket. The air around him registered somewhere between 54 degrees Fahrenheit and 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 to 14 degrees Celsius. His water bucket was not frozen. His iron stove had not been fed since just before midnight. This is the story of what he built, why almost no one believed it would work, and why, by the time that blizzard finally lifted, several of the most skeptical men in the valley were standing in his doorway with their hats in their hands, asking him to explain it from the beginning. To understand what Callum Reedford built, you have to understand the place and the moment in which he built it. The year was 1887. The region was the northern stretch of the Montana Territory, a high plains corridor where the Rocky Mountain foothills gave way to open grassland, and the sky sat so low in winter that it felt like a ceiling pressing down on everything beneath it. Settlers had been moving into this corridor for roughly 2 decades, drawn by the promise of free land under the Homestead Act and the newly completed rail lines that made the journey survivable, if not comfortable. By the mid-1880s, small communities had taken root along the creek valleys. Clusters of homesteads, a general store, a church, maybe a school if the settlement was lucky. The winters here were not forgiving. Average January temperatures ran between 5 degrees Fahrenheit and 15 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 15 degrees Celsius to minus 9 degrees Celsius, and every third or fourth winter brought a stretch of deep cold that tested the limits of both structures and people. But the winter of 1886 to 1887, known in regional oral accounts as the Big Die-Up, was categorically different. It arrived early in November, with a series of ice storms that sealed the grassland under a crust of frozen rain. Then came the cold. Sustained temperatures dropped below minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 34 degrees Celsius across much of the territory for weeks at a time. And in early February of 1887, a blizzard moved through the region that local records describe as the most severe in living memory. Winds exceeding 40 miles per hour, visibility near zero, temperatures falling to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 40 degrees Celsius, and holding there for nearly 72 hours. The cattle industry across the northern plains lost an estimated 60 to 90% of its herds that winter. Homesteaders who had built quickly and cheaply, as most had, discovered that the walls that felt adequate in October were nearly useless in February, with smoke poured back down chimneys. Single-pane windows leaked cold air like open vents. The frontier was delivering a masterclass in the difference between shelter and survival. It was into this landscape, and this winter, that Callum Reedford had arrived the previous spring, carrying an idea that the people around him considered, at best, eccentric. To appreciate the problem Reedford was trying to solve, it helps to look carefully at how the typical settler cabin of that era was built. Because the construction logic of the frontier, efficient as it was in many ways, contained a fundamental thermal flaw that almost no one had stopped to examine. The standard homestead cabin in northern Montana in the 1880s followed a well-established pattern. Walls were built from single courses of round or hewn logs, typically 8 to 10 inches, 20 to 25 centimeters in diameter, stacked horizontally and chinked with a combination of moss, clay, and wood scraps. The total wall thickness, measured straight through, rarely exceeded 12 inches, 30 centimeters. Roofs were either sod-over pole construction or split shake with shingles laid over rough sawn rafters, with minimal, if any, dead airspace between the interior ceiling and the exterior roof surface. Floors were usually packed earth or rough-hewn planks laid directly on the ground, offering no insulating layer between the living space and the frozen soil below. At the center of the structure sat the fireplace, or, in more updated cabins, a cast-iron box stove. Both systems operated on the same principle: burn wood, generate heat, push warm air into the room. The problem was that with heat without thermal mass is transient. The moment the fire dimmed, the room began to cool. And in a single-wall log cabin with no buffer against the outside air, cooling happened fast, often within 45 to 60 minutes of a fire dying down. To maintain a livable temperature through a winter night, a family needed to keep the fire burning continuously, which meant someone had to wake every 2 to 3 hours to add wood. The numbers were brutal. A typical settler family in northern Montana burned between 8 and 14 cords of wood per winter, a cord being a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long, roughly 3.6 cubic meters. Cutting, splitting, hauling, and stacking that volume would consume the significant portion of productive months before winter. And even with that investment, the thermal performance of the standard cabin was poor. Interior temperatures in an unattended cabin on a minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 29 degrees Celsius night could fall below freezing within 2 hours of the fire going cold. Families knew the cold intimately. They knew it by the thickness of ice on the water bucket in the morning. They knew it by the way their breath fogged at the breakfast table. They knew it by the numb fingers and the children who woke coughing. This was simply the cost of living on the frontier, and most people accepted it as unchangeable. The way gravity is unchangeable, or the way the wind comes from the northwest in February, without apology. Callum Reed Ford did not accept it. And the reason he didn't was that he had, one afternoon the previous autumn, walked into his barn and noticed something that stopped him cold, in the most literal sense of the phrase. Callum Reed Ford was not an engineer by training, and he would have been the first to tell you so. He was a carpenter by trade, born in 1851 in County Antrim in the north of Ireland, trained in timber framing and rough construction during the lean years after the famine's long shadow. He had come to America in 1873, worked his way across the Midwest doing barn and mill construction, and arrived in the Montana Territory in the spring of 1886 with a homestead claim, a set of hand tools, and a habit of observation that his neighbors would later describe as quiet, persistent, and occasionally maddening. He was not the kind of man who talked much about what he was thinking. He watched. He measured things with his eye and his hand when he had no instrument. He asked the kind of questions that seemed, to the people around him, slightly beside the point. Questions about where the frost formed first on a window, about which side of a log stack dried fastest, about why certain buildings held their warmth longer than others, even when they appeared identical from the outside. It was in late October of 1886, during one of the first hard frosts of the season, that Reed Ford walked into his barn at roughly 6 in the morning to check on his 2 draft horses. The temperature outside was 18 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 8 degrees Celsius. He had expected the barn interior to be nearly as cold. Instead, he stopped just inside the door and stood still for a long moment, processing what his skin was telling him. The air inside the barn felt, not warm exactly, but measurably less cold than the air outside. He estimated later, by comparison with indoor temperatures he knew, that the barn interior was holding somewhere around 32 degrees Fahrenheit to 36 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 to 2 degrees Celsius, a difference of at least 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit from the outside air, with no heat source of any kind. He spent the next hour examining the barn's construction, which was nothing exceptional. Vertical board and batten siding over a rough frame, gaps in the boards, a hay-pack loft overhead, a dirt floor. No insulation by any modern definition. And yet the structure was clearly buffering the exterior cold in a meaningful way. The hay in the loft was part of it. Hay is a remarkable insulator, trapping dead air in its fiber structure. The sheer volume of the barn's interior created thermal inertia. A large air mass cools more slowly than a small one. But there was something else Reed Ford kept coming back to as he stood there. The gap between the barn's outer skin and its interior airspace was acting like a buffer, absorbing the first shock of the cold before it reached the center of the building. He walked back to his cabin, sat down at the rough table near the stove, and drew a shape on the back of an envelope, a small curved structure, like the cross-section of a half-buried barrel. He drew it sitting inside a larger rectangle. The larger rectangle was a barn. The small curved shape was a cabin. A second, smaller enclosure built inside the first. If the barn alone could buffer the cold by 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, he reasoned, and if he then placed a small, well-insulated, tightly sealed living space inside the barn, a space with its own stove and its own thermal mass, the two envelopes together would create a layered defense against the cold that no single-wall cabin could match. The barn would absorb the first wave. The inner cabin would hold the second. The dead air between them, that gap of 6 to 10 feet, 1.8 to 3 m of unheated barn space, would act as an invisible insulating layer, still and cold, but far warmer than the air outside. He had seen curved roofs perform well in wind. Less surface area catching the gale, snow shedding cleanly instead of loading onto flat plains. He had worked with bentwood framing on boat sheds in Wisconsin. He knew the geometry was strong and the construction achievable with the materials at hand. He folded the envelope and put it in his coat pocket. That winter, he was going to build a Quonset cabin inside a barn, and he was going to do it with salvaged wood, canvas, and approximately 2 tons of dry laid stone. Whether it would work was a question that the coming blizzard would answer for him, whether he was ready for the answer or not. Reed Ford began construction in the first week of November 1886. Working alone in the hours between his daily chores and the early dark of the northern winter. He had no blueprint beyond the sketch on the envelope. He had no surveying equipment, no milled lumber order from a catalog, and no budget that could absorb mistakes. What he had was a barn roughly 36 feet long and 22 feet wide, 11 m times 6.7 m, a pile of salvaged materials accumulated over 8 months of work across the territory, and construction logic that he had been refining in his head since that October morning. The inner cabin measured 14 feet in length and 10 feet in width, 4.3 m times 3 m, at its base, small enough to heat efficiently, large enough for a man to live in without losing his mind through a long winter. The shape was a critical decision. Rather than building a conventional rectangular box with a pitched roof, Reed Ford bent his framing into a series of curved ribs, arch members made by steaming and bending 2-inch by 4-inch, 5 centimeters times 10 centimeters. Hemlock planks salvaged from a collapsed mill shed 20 miles to the south. Each rib spanned the full width of the cabin and rose to a peak approximately 8 feet, 2.4 meters, above the floor at the center. He set 7 ribs in total, spaced 24 inches, 61 centimeters, apart along the length of the structure, then connected them with horizontal purlins, thin strips of pine running the length of the cabin, locked into notches cut into the face of each rib. Over this curved skeleton, he stretched a double-layer material. The inner layer was heavy canvas, the remnant of a freight wagon cover, pulled tight over the ribs and lashed the purlins with rawhide cord. Over the canvas, he laid a secondary layer, overlapping strips of flattened tin cut from salvaged food cans and nail keg lids, hammered flat and tacked in shingle fashion from the base of each rib upward. The tin layer served 2 purposes. It reflected radiant heat back toward the interior and created a secondary air pocket between itself and the canvas beneath, a gap of roughly half an inch, 1.3 centimeters, that functioned as an additional insulating buffer. The floor was the piece that most people, when they later heard Reed Ford describe it, found hardest to believe. He did not build on the barn's dirt floor directly. Instead, he excavated the interior footprint of the cabin to a depth of 14 inches, 35 centimeters, then filled that excavation with dry-laid flat sandstone, stones he had pulled from the creek bank over the course of the previous summer, carried by sled and stacked in the corner of the barn since August. The total weight of stone in the floor came to approximately 2,200 pounds, roughly 1,000 kilograms. Over the stone, he laid a single course of rough-sawn pine planks, elevated 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters, above the stone surface on small wooden standoffs to allow air circulation beneath. The logic was straightforward, even if the labor was not. Sandstone holds heat with remarkable efficiency. A mass of 2,200 pounds of stone, once warmed by a stove, will release that store heat slowly and steadily over 6 to 10 hours, long after the fire itself has gone cold. The stone does not produce heat. It banks it, the way a river holds a warmth of summer afternoon long into the evening. In a conventional cabin, the floor is a liability, a permanent cold surface pulling heat downward into the frozen earth. Reed Ford had turned his floor into an asset. At the eastern end of the cabin, he installed a small cast-iron box stove, a Quebec pattern unit he had purchased secondhand from a bankrupt trading post, weighing 87 pounds, 39.5 kilograms, positioned on a raised hearth of mortar fieldstone that elevated its base 8 inches, 20 centimeters, above the plank floor. The stovepipe ran vertically through a tin collar in the roof peak and then horizontally through the barn wall, with a short external stack to draw the exhaust out and away. He packed the collar joint with a mixture of ash and wet clay, which hardened as it dried into a near-airtight seal. The door was a single piece of double-layer construction, 2 courses of pine board sandwiching a 2-inch, 5 centimeters, layer of tightly packed wool batting. The clipped remnants of a sheep shearing from a neighbor's flock that autumn, collected for the purpose in a feed sack. The door hung on iron strap hinges and seated against a rabbit frame that Reed Ford had planed smooth and straight, ensuring a tight fit with no gaps at the edges. When it closed with a sound that surprised him, a solid, muffled thud, like something being sealed. He completed the inner cabin on November 19th, 1886. He lit the stove for the first time that evening, burning 3 small logs of split pine, and sat in the camp chair he had brought inside to wait. Within 40 minutes, the interior temperature, measured against the back of his hand pressed to the stone floor, had climbed to what he estimated was somewhere above 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 15.5 degrees Celsius. He let the fire die at midnight, rolled into his bedroll on the plank floor, and slept without waking until a pale gray light came through the single small window he had cut into the eastern rib. He was warm, not comfortable warm, the way a well-appointed parlor is warm. Warm in a way that matters. Warm in the bones. Warm through the night. Warm when the fire is no longer burning and the temperature outside has fallen to 12 degrees Fahrenheit minus 11 degrees Celsius, and the barn around him is silent and dark. He pulled on his coat, stepped outside into the cold, exhaled a long breath of steam, and went to feed his horses. Before we reveal what happened when the real cold arrived, and how the numbers from that blizzard would silence every skeptic in the valley, make sure to like this video, subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter, and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Stories like this one, forgotten, practical, built by ordinary people under impossible conditions, are what this channel is all about. Word travels fast in small settlements. By the end of the first week of December, most of the homesteaders within a 5-mile radius of Reed Ford's claimed knew something about what he was building, or thought they did. The details had passed through enough conversations to acquire a layer of exaggeration on one end and a layer of dismissal on the other. But the core of the story was consistent. The Irish carpenter was sleeping inside his barn, in some kind of curved tent made of scrap tin and old canvas, and he seemed to think this was going to keep him warmer than a proper cabin. The reaction in the settlement was not unkind. Exactly. Frontier communities depended on one another too much for outright cruelty. But it was skeptical in a particular way that experienced men become skeptical when someone appears to be reinventing something they believe is already settled. These were people who had built cabins and survived winters before. Several of them had been doing it for 15 or 20 years. They had developed strong opinions about what worked and what didn't, and those opinions were not easily revised. Niels Bergstrom, a Norwegian-born homesteader who had been in the territory since 1871, and whose own cabin was widely considered one of the tightest-built structures in the valley, was among the first to visit and offer his assessment. He stood inside the barn, looked at the curved structure Reed Ford had built, walked around it once, and then looked at Reed Ford with an expression that fell somewhere between concern and patient exasperation. "You got gaps in that canvas top," he said. "Cold air will find every one of them." He pointed to the junction between 2 of the tin shingles near the base of the structure, where a slight misalignment had left a seam of perhaps 1/8 of an inch, 3 millimeters, visible. "Wind comes through a gap that size. It'll pull the heat right out of there. You know that." Reed Ford listened without arguing. He thanked Bergstrom for the observation, and after the man left, he went over every seam in the tin layer with a brush loaded with a mixture of pine pitch and wood ash, sealing the visible gaps. It was useful criticism, and he took it as such. Not all of the feedback was as practical. Garrett Foss, who ran the Cutbank Creek Trading Post and fancied himself the settlement's informal authority on construction, visited a few days later and spent most of his time explaining to Reed Ford why the curved roof was structurally unsound. "Round shapes don't shed snow like a pitched roof does," he said, gesturing at the barn ceiling above the cabin's arc. "Snow loads up on a flat curve. You'll have a collapse before February." He did not appear to notice that the barn's own roof, a conventional pitch design, was a structure that would actually bear the snow, not the inner cabin. When Reed Ford pointed this out, Foss looked at the barn ceiling for a moment, then at the inner cabin roof, and then said, with somewhat less certainty, "Well, still seems like a lot of bother for a man living alone." The deeper resistance was harder to name, but easier to feel. Reed Ford's design implied something uncomfortable for people around him, that the way they had all been building, the way their fathers and neighbors had built, was not as efficient as they believed. The prospect that a man with no more experience or resources than anyone else might stay measurably warmer through the same winter, using less wood, with less effort, that was not a neutral observation. It was implicitly a critique. And people who had suffered through hard winters do not always welcome the suggestion that their suffering was, in part, optional. By Christmas of 1886, opinion in the settlement had roughly divided. A handful of men, mostly younger homesteaders who had not yet hardened their construction habits, were curious and open. They asked specific questions about the stone floor, the canvas layer, the stovepipe routing. They took measurements with their eyes and nodded at the answers. The older, more established builders had largely decided the experiment was a curiosity at best and a waste of effort at worst. They would wait for winter to deliver its verdict, as it always did. They did not have to wait long. The cold that had been building across the northern plains since October arrived in force in the first week of January 1887. Then, on the night of February 3rd, the blizzard began. It came from the northwest, the way the worst storms always came, and it announced itself the afternoon before it arrived with a particular quality of light, a flat, yellow-gray dimness that experienced plainsmen knew meant serious, weather within 12 to 18 hours. By nightfall on February 3rd, the wind was already running at 25 miles per hour, 40 kilometers per hour, and the temperature had dropped to minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 28 degrees Celsius. By midnight, it was minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 33 degrees Celsius. By the early morning of February 4th, the thermometer outside the Cutbank Creek trading post, the settlement's most reliable weather instrument, a mercury column in a wooden shelter nailed to the store's north wall, had sunk to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 40 degrees Celsius, and stopped moving meaningfully for the next 62 hours. The blizzard's winds peaked between 35 and 45 miles per hour, 56 to 72 kilometers per hour, driving a horizontal curtain of snow so dense that visibility at 10 feet 3 meters was near zero. The wind chill at those speeds and temperatures, a concept not formally articulated in American meteorology until decades later, but one that every person who stepped outside understood immediately in their skin and lungs, pushed the effective felt temperature below minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 57 degrees Celsius by some later estimations. In the settlement's conventional cabins, the story of those 62 hours was told in wood and cold and exhaustion. Nils Bergstrom, whose cabin was genuinely among the better-built structures in the valley, burned through nearly half a cord of wood in the first 24 hours of the blizzard, feeding his stove every hour and a half to maintain an interior temperature that local accounts placed between 38 degrees Fahrenheit and 44 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 to 7 degrees Celsius. Cold enough that the water in his kitchen bucket developed a skim of ice each time the fire cycled low. He did not sleep for more than 40 minutes at a stretch over 3 days. The Foss family at the trading post fared better than most, having a larger building with more thermal mass in its log walls, but even there the cold was a physical presence in the room. Something fell in the face and hands at any distance from the stove. Garrett Foss's youngest daughter woke on the second morning with frost on the interior of the blanket she had pulled over her head. 2 families on the northern edge of the settlement were forced to abandon their cabins. The structures, both single-room log construction with south-facing doors that the wind drove directly against, lost heat faster than their stoves could replace it. Without enough fuel to sustain continuous burning, the interior temperatures fell toward freezing within hours. Both families made the dangerous journey to the trading post on foot, navigating by fence lines in near-zero visibility, arriving cold and shaken but unharmed. On the ridge above Cutbank Creek, in the old weathered barn, Callum Reed Ford stoked his small Quebec stove twice on the night of February 3rd, once at 10 in the evening and once at roughly 2 in the morning, burning a total of approximately 6 split logs across both feedings. Then he went back to sleep. He had developed, over the previous 2 months, a simple measurement system for understanding the thermal behavior of his structure. Each morning, before lighting the stove, he placed his hand flat on the sandstone floor and held it there for 30 seconds, not to measure a precise temperature, but to track a consistent baseline. On ordinary cold mornings in December and January, the stone had felt cool to the touch but not biting, what he described in a brief written account as feeling like a cellar wall in late autumn. On the mornings of the blizzard, after 2 stoke cycles and a full night's sleep, the stone floor of his cabin felt, by his description, like a hearthstone an hour after the fire. The thermal mass had worked precisely as he had anticipated, absorbing the stove's output over the evening firings and releasing it slowly and steadily through the night. Later, when the storm had passed and the settlement had begun to take stock of itself, a rough accounting emerged. The figures were reconstructed from local testimony and records kept by several homesteaders, and while they are not laboratory measurements, they are consistent and credible. In the conventional log cabins of the settlement, interior temperatures during the peak of the blizzard, with fires burning continuously, range from 36 degrees Fahrenheit to 48 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 to 9 degrees Celsius, depending on quality of construction and the volume of wood being consumed. Average wood consumption over the 62-hour blizzard period ran between 1.2 and 1.8 cords across the household surveyed. Sleep was interrupted. Water froze. Children cried from the cold. Inside Reed Ford's Quonset cabin, within its barn envelope, the interior temperature at no point during the blizzard fell below an estimated 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius, achieved with a total wood consumption of approximately 18 to 22 split logs over the entire 62-hour period. Converted to cord equivalents, this represented roughly 1/12 to 1/15 of the fuel burned in conventional cabins during the same event. The gap between the barn's outer wall and the inner cabin, that's 6 to 8 feet, 1.8 to 2.4 m of still unheated air, had buffered the first thermal assault from the outside. The stone floor had stored and re-radiated heat through the night. The curved roof's geometry had shed the wind pressure that hammered flat surfaces, reducing the rate at which infiltrating cold air could push through any remaining gaps. The wool batting door had sealed the single most vulnerable point in the structure's envelope. Each element had done its part, not through magic, but through the compounding of simple physical principles: thermal mass, dead air insulation, geometry, and radiant heat retention. On the morning of February 6, when the blizzard finally eased and the sky turned from white to a pale, clean blue, Reed Ford walked out of the barn, looked across the valley at the smoke rising in thin, exhausted columns from the settlement's cabins, and stood in the still cold air for a long moment. Then he went back inside, put a fresh log on the stove, and put a kettle on for coffee. He had nothing dramatic to say about it. The structure had worked. The physics had done what physics always does when you take the trouble to understand it. The men who came to Reed Ford's barn the days after the blizzard did not come making speeches. They came the way people come to things that have surprised them, quietly, with their eyes open. They stood inside the barn and looked at the curved inner cabin, and some of them reached out and pressed a hand to the stone floor through the cabin's open door, the way he had described, to feel for themselves what stored thermal mass meant in practice. Several of them said nothing for a long time. Nils Bergstrom, who had been the most technically specific in his earlier skepticism, was also the most direct in his reassessment. He spent nearly 2 hours with Reed Ford that first afternoon, asking careful questions about the stone floor depth, the canvas tension on the ribs, the sealing of the stovepipe collar. He measured the gap between the barn wall and the cabin exterior with his arm span. He asked how many logs had been burned during the blizzard's worst hours, and when Reed Ford told him, Bergstrom was quiet for a moment, then said, "I burned 31 cords last winter." This is the same winter. He looked at the stove, the small, second-hand Quebec unit, and back at Reed Ford. "I need to understand the floor." Garrett Foss did not visit the barn, but 3 weeks after the blizzard, he began building a secondary interior structure in the back room of the trading post, a small, tightly sealed sleeping room with a stone-packed floor, separated from the main building by an air gap and insulated with hay bales stacked against its exterior walls. He told anyone who asked that it was a storage room. No one pressed him on it. By the spring of 1887, at least 4 homesteads in the Cutbank Creek corridor had incorporated elements of Reed Ford's approach into either new construction or modifications to existing buildings. Not all of them replicated the full double envelope system. Some lacked the barn structure to work within or the salvaged stone, but the principle spread in the practical way frontier knowledge always spread, through observation, conversation, and imitation. The curved inner cabin inside a barn outer shell, the stone-packed floor, the dead air buffer, the wool-lined door. Taken individually, none of these elements was entirely new. Curved roofs had been used for centuries in boat construction and military engineering. Stone-packed floors appeared in various forms in European peasant architecture, going back to the medieval period. The concept of a secondary shelter within a larger outer structure was known, in different forms, in the earth lodges of the Plains nations, in the Bears of the Aleutian Islands, in the Norse longhouse tradition, where humans and animals shared a common envelope specifically because the animal's body heat contributed to the interior warmth. What Reed Ford had done was not invent something new. He had observed something real, the thermal behavior of his barn on a cold morning, and followed that observation with disciplined logic to its practical conclusion. He had taken knowledge that existed in fragments across different traditions and different continents, and assembled it into a coherent system, scaled to the materials and conditions he actually had, not the ones he wished he had. That is what frontier engineering looked like when it worked. Not genius, not luck, observation, followed by reason, tested by crisis. The cabin stood inside the Reed Ford barn until 1903. When Callum Reed Ford sold the property and moved north to the Canadian Territory. The man who purchased the homestead tore the inner cabin down within a year, finding it strange and inconvenient. He built a conventional addition to the house instead. The first winter he spent in it, according to a brief notation in a county land record, he burned 11 cords of wood. We have been building the same way ever since, and paying the same price. The principles that Reed Ford understood intuitively in 1886 are not lost. They appear today in passive house design, in double envelope construction, in the thermal mass specifications of modern green building codes. Architects and engineers have given them formal names and laboratory measurements and certification processes. But the underlying physics is unchanged from what one Irish carpenter felt on his hand on a cold stone floor after a long night in the worst blizzard in 48 years. The frontier did not have the luxury of forgetting what worked. We do, and we have used it. The question worth sitting with is not how they survived with so little. It is how much of what they understood we have quietly decided we no longer need. If this story stayed with you, if there's something the image of one man building warmth out of salvaged stone and bent wood and patient observation that speaks to something you recognize, then like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you've ever built something the experts said wouldn't work. We're building a library here, one forgotten technique, one overlooked builder, one tested idea at a time. The next chapter is already waiting. Educational disclaimer. This video features frontier-inspired narratives created for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, personal stories, names, and specific situations portrayed are fictional reconstructions. However, many of the building methods, survival concepts, and practical ideas discussed are inspired by real historical techniques, traditional practices, and basic physical principles used in past frontier environments. Any modern use of these ideas should be carefully evaluated according to current safety standards, building codes, regulations, and professional guidance. This content is intended for educational and historical interest only and should not be considered professional, technical, or legal advice.